Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarCrest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 313 and we're covering Gaudium et Spes 27 and 28 on all our neighbors. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we had an important paragraphs on the rights. So the church embraces good things of society like rights, more connection, and social development. Today, we're going to continue with chapter 2, the community of mankind. And we're really dealing with others here. So we need to care for our neighbors as Jesus would and respect their views. So moving on straight into our first paragraph, paragraph 27 has 3 subparagraphs. We'll read A and B together, which are about we must care for our neighbors following the lines of Matthew 25. Then we'll read C, how acts of human dignity corrupt the doer more than the receiver. Acts contrary to human dignity, not acts of human dignity, obviously. Because acts of human dignity do not corrupt either. Anyway, so let's get straight into A and B. 27A. Coming down to practical and particularly urgent consequences, this council lays stress on reverence for man. Everyone must consider his every neighbor without exception as another self. Take into account, first of all, his life and the means necessary to living it with dignity, so as not to imitate the rich man who had no concern for the poor man Lazarus. B. In our times, a special obligation binds us to make ourselves the neighbor of every person, without exception, and of actively helping him when he comes across our path. Whether they be an old person abandoned by all, a foreign laborer unjustly looked down upon, a refugee, a child born of an unlawful union and wrongly suffering for a sin he did not commit, or a hungry person who disturbs our conscience by recalling the voice of the Lord. As long as you did it for one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it for me. Matthew 25. Even though this subparagraph only quotes Matthew 25 in the very last line, the entire subparagraph, or the entire 2 subparagraphs, are basically an analysis of Matthew 25. And that's the passage where Jesus is talking about the one in prison, you visited the one who is naked, you clothed, etc. And this is the basic gospel message. We need to treat our neighbors as ourselves. Love the other as you would love to be treated. And this is a big part of our Christian life in the wider society. And it notes here that living is not just being alive, but living with dignity, living in our accord with our dignity. And we should help people do that. Wider society means we need to treat all as our neighbor, every person, right? The marginalized people they talk about here, foreign laborer, refugee, child born to fornication, etc. I recently wrote an article on charity to autistics, which you find on my website, frmatthewlc.com, that kind of talks about this in the introduction, how at different ages we have different ones who are the ones who are maligned, mistreated on the edges, and we need to care for them. And today, to an extent, that's autistics. Moving on to paragraph C, it talks about how, subparagraph 27C, it talks about acts contrary to human dignity corrupt the doer more than the receiver. Let's read it. Furthermore, whatever is opposed to life itself, such as any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of another person, such as mutilation, torments inflicted on mind or body, attempts to coerce the will itself, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions, where men are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their like are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than those who suffer from injury. Moreover, they are a supreme dishonor to the Creator. This subparagraph, to an extent, just gives us a long line of things that are against dignity, and things that we have a challenge of in our society. Too often our society is divided into two different groups, and one group is very opposed to abortion. The other group is very opposed to unjust treatment of laborers. But as Catholics, we're opposed to both. We care for both the laborer who is treated unjustly and the child who is threatened with abortion. We need to looking for dignity in all things, not just the things that support our particular political party. And it notes at the end how these all harm society, but they harm the doer, the one who does them, more than the receiver. So often we think of, if you're treating someone unjustly, oh, that's poor for them. But you're corrupting your own soul by treating that person unjustly. And that's really bad for you, the one who's treating them unjustly, not just for them who are treated unjustly. Let's move on to our second paragraph, 28 here. We'll read it all together. And the three subparagraphs A to C are about we need to respect those we disagree with and pray for our enemies. Let's read it. 28A. Respect and love ought to be extended also to those who think or act differently than we do in social, political, and even religious matters. In fact, the more deeply we come to understand their ways of thinking through such courtesy and love, the more easily we'll be able to enter into dialogue with them. B. This love and goodwill, to be sure, must in no way render us indifferent to the truth and goodness. Indeed, love impels itself the disciples of Christ to speak the saving truth to all men. But it is necessary to distinguish between error, which always merits repudiation, and the person error, who never loses dignity of being a person, even when he is flawed by false or inadequate religious notions. God alone is the judge and searcher of hearts. For that reason, he forbids us to make judgments about the internal guilt of anyone. C. The teaching of Christ even requires that we forgive injuries, and extends the law of love to include every enemy, according to the command of the new law. You have heard that it was said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, do good those who hate you, and pray for those who persecute and calumniate you. Matthew 5. Here, in this paragraph, we're talking about starting with thinking of others as persons. That came from 27, which we were just talking about, the previous paragraph. But it is important to respect them as persons. Even when it notes we are correcting people, we don't correct them, we correct their error. I know I was talking to somebody who was talking about a certain kind of terminology where somebody was, racist or something, and they were afraid to critique one thing, and I'm like, you can critique that idea of that person, not referencing the race, because the race isn't really relevant to this, and because that idea is not problematic, right? But we don't critique that person or that race. We don't use the ad hominem or the unpleasant bedfellows argument. We look for an actual critique if we're going to critique them. And so we try to understand people's perspective. We want to be better able to help them. We want to build this up in love. We still need to distinguish error, obviously, but also with distinguishing error, not every idea that might be different is necessarily an error. There's numerous things that the East and West understand differently, but which the Church of East and West has agreed are perfectly fine in the two different ways to consider them. And we shouldn't break that. Finally, in this last subparagraph here, it talks about praying for enemies, forgiving them. This is important. This is the Christian message. We aren't here to be, we're conquering, we slaughter enemies and we're the best and all you are, the worst. No, we need to pray for them. We need to forgive them. Thus concludes today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with the next paragraphs of Gaudium Spes. Those are paragraphs 29 to 30 on human equality and dignity. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan.
Amen.